You've probably heard of Sir Isaac Newton, the guy who had an apple fall on his head. He defined the law of universal gravitation, enunciated the basic laws of motion, and on the side invented calculus. But you might never have heard of Isaac Newton, the detective, whose analytical skills captured one of the most notorious criminals in the kingdom. History's smartest detective deserves to be remembered. By 1696, Newton was already a well-known figure. He formulated the foundations of calculus and did pioneering research in optics and gravity. He was appointed Master of Trinity College in 1669 and elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1672. His invention of the reflecting telescope in 1668 and publishing of Principia in 1687 established his reputation as a scientist across Europe. Newton stood at the forefront of a scientific revolution that led directly to the Age of Enlightenment. Improving technology and scientific understanding were changing the way that the world worked in all manner of fields, and one of the most important was in coinage. For most of history, coins were minted via hammering. Blank-heated planchets of metal, generally roughly circular, would be set on the anvil die with one side of the coin design, while the minter hit a second die with a hammer. Later, instead of using planchets, strips of metal could be hammered and the coins cut out. These coins were not uniform, and the strikes were often off-center. They were incredibly labor-intensive to produce, and dies wore out relatively quickly. In an era where coins were generally made of valuable metals, the lack of uniformity made the coins easier to counterfeit and easy to debase by clipping or shaving off pieces of the coin. As large supplies of gold and silver began to reach Europe from the New World, counterfeiting grew out of control as overworked mints made less complex and more easily copied designs. Screw presses were old machines, but it was only in the 1500s that they began to be used to press coins. They were fast and produced high-quality coins, but were labor-intensive, requiring as many as 7 men to run them. Around 1550, Charles de Marillac, the French ambassador in Augsburg, heard rumors of a new machine. The details remain mysterious. Marillac wanted to acquire the system for the French alone, and so he never actually named the inventor, instead calling him Le Chevalier de Saint-Sepulchre. The inventor refused to leave Augsburg to oversee the construction of his machines in France, and so he remained officially unidentified, although some believe he was an engineer named Max Schwab. Schwab's machine was an improved screw press and included a collar, which could be used to mold the edges of coins to give them ridges, called reading, or text that made it easy to tell if a coin had been clipped. Most importantly, he had a system for rolling metal sheets to a uniform thickness to cut blanks, which were then stamped by the milling machine, so named because of its resemblance to grain milling. The machine did not catch on in France, however, thanks to opposition from coiners who still worked by hand. The system didn't become dominant in coinage until the 1640s, and the Dutch didn't use it extensively until 1670. A few milled coins were struck in England in the Great Recoinage in 1560, and Spain started milling coins in 1586. England again experimented with milled coinage in 1632, but it was only in 1660 that Charles II brought in the Frenchman Peter Blondeau to establish coin milling at the Royal Mint. Blondeau introduced another innovation in a secret process to place designs on the coin's edge. His coins bore the Latin inscription Decus se tutamen, a phrase from Virgil's Aeneid meaning an ornament and a safeguard, meant to deter clipping. The issuance of the new higher quality coins actually exacerbated the coinage crisis in England, however. There's a law in economics named after Sir Thomas Gresham that states that bad money will drive out good. The higher quality milled coins stayed out of circulation as people wished to keep the good money and spent instead the bad money. This was exacerbated by the issue of bimetallism, meaning that both gold and silver were accepted as legal tender. Silver, Levinson explains, was worth less in England than it was on the continent. The difference was roughly 1.5 pennies per ounce of silver. It was a simple thing to collect silver English coins and use them to buy gold in France, where they could buy more gold than you could in England, and then use the gold to buy more silver in England. It was the nearest thing imaginable to a financial perpetual motion machine, Levinson says. In 1699, the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, a guild which dealt in precious metals, complained that 282,120 ounces of silver had been shipped out of England to France, more than 10% of the total silver coinage struck at the Royal Mint in the last decade. Between 1691 and 1695, the Royal Mint curtailed silver mintages simply because they could not obtain the silver. The pressure on commerce, as the base coins which drove it disappeared, became unbearable, but nothing was done until 1695, when King William found that he couldn't pay his soldiers fighting in France. William needed an enormous amount of money, and clipped English silver coins were becoming such a problem that traders wouldn't accept them at face value. In November, William begged the House of Commons to find a solution, arguing that the great difficulty we lie under at this time was caused by the ill state of the coin. William Lowndes, Secretary of the Treasury, began looking for a solution by asking some of the leading English thinkers, men like John Locke, Christopher Wren, and Isaac Newton. Newton, among others, approached the problem rationally. The threat of death wasn't stopping counterfeiters and silver clippers, so bad coinage had to be taken out of circulation in a great recoinage. Newton argued that milled money needed to be of the same intrinsic and extrinsic value, to bring the value of a silver coin's metallic value in line with its face value. Essentially a devaluation of the currency. The government balked at that, but it did agree that recoinage was necessary and repaid Newton by giving him a job. On March 19, 1696, he received a letter from the Chancellor of the Exchequer notifying him that the king wanted to make Mr. Newton Warden of the Mint. Newton left Cambridge 2 days later for the Mint, and then located within the Tower of London. The appointment was not meant to be especially labor-intensive. The Chancellor told Newton that the job would not require more attendance than you can spare. But Newton wasn't a man for half measures. The lack of coinage presented a golden opportunity for counterfeiters like William Chaloner. Chaloner had been trained to make nails, but nail-making was a dying industry as better, more efficient methods appeared, and nail-makers were turning to other, more lucrative projects, including counterfeiting. By 1696, Newton estimated that 10% of the money supply was counterfeit. Counterfeiters of the period made their coins of pewter, copper, tin, and such like metals. Mary Corbett, who went to the court in 1684 for counterfeiting, poured the molten metal into molds of wood. Counterfeiting the milled coins was more difficult, but some managed it, with sheet cutters, homemade dies, presses, and even tools to mill edges. Some, like Chaloner, made coins out of actual silver, but slightly smaller than actual coinage. By the time Newton arrived, the Great Recoinage was already underway, with dozens of workers working tirelessly to make new coins. Newton, as warden, had to share power with 2 others, including a controller and, more importantly, the mint master. The warden was responsible only for maintaining the mint facilities, but the master was in charge of actual production. The master was then Thomas Neal, who was known as such a gambler that he had to post a £15,000 bond to hold the position. Neal entrusted most of that to an assistant and pocketed the profits. To him was entrusted the recoinage of £7 million in 3 years, more than the mint had produced in the last 30 years. In May of 1696, the Treasury stopped accepting the old hand-hammered coins for tax payments. Neal hadn't produced enough coins for there to be enough in circulation afterward. Suddenly the whole country had no money on hand. John Evelyn wrote that there was a want of current money to carry on the smallest concerns, even for daily provisions in the markets. Newton became warden on May 2, 1696, right in the middle of the crisis. Newton threw himself into the work. He familiarized himself with mint operations and history, and soon he simply nudged Neal aside. While Neal remained at his post, Newton was now effectively the mint master as well as its warden. Newton did exhaustive research into the most efficient means of minting coins. He added more smelting furnaces, 8 new rolling mills, and 5 new presses. He calculated charcoal use and studied his workers to determine the most efficient methods and work speeds. He improved production from £15,000 worth of coins a week to more than 50,000, and at the end of the summer, 1696, the mint produced a record £100,000 in 6 days. The recoinage ended ahead of schedule and was completed by mid-year 1698. A year later, the mint sold off its extra machines. The entire country's stock of silver money, £6.8 million worth of it, had been restruck, the cost of around £2.7 million. A mint assistant later said that Newton was peculiarly qualified for managing the recoinage because of his extraordinary skill in numbers and his great integrity. To fight counterfeiting, Newton focused on improving details. He wasn't a great innovator, but exacting in attention to detail. He would later write that he brought coinage to a much greater degree of exactness than was ever known before. There was another angle to the job, however, and one Newton didn't like. It was the warden's job to prosecute currency crimes like counterfeiting within London. Newton complained that prosecuting coiners was not imposed upon any of my predecessors, and he asked that the job be given to someone else, but that was refused. But Newton also wouldn't entrust the investigations to underlings, as essentially every warden before or after him did. He led the investigations himself. In 1696, Charles Montague, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, received a petition signed by William Chaloner, then imprisoned at Newgate. Chaloner made sensational claims, a scathing indictment of incompetency and conspiracy at the Mint. Chaloner claimed that people within the Mint were counterfeiting and that dies had been sold by the chief engraver himself. Another counterfeiter, however, instead said that the dies had been stolen by a gang that included Chaloner himself. The investigation, tangled in contradictory statements, fell apart. Enter Newton. Newton interrogated several counterfeiters seeking the missing dies. Thomas White, one of the accused, was likely to hang for his crimes, and Newton dangled the promise of a reprieve for months. He delayed the hanging 13 times in all. White was eventually pardoned. The strategy led to multiple arrests. He interviewed Chaloner in the fall of 1696, who stuck to the story that there was a conspiracy within the Mint. Newton let him go. Newton didn't know it yet, but Chaloner was, according to John Craig in Newton at the Mint, the most accomplished counterfeiter in the kingdom. He began his first major counterfeiting scheme in 1691, making at least thousands of pistoles, a small gold coin, and a great number of guineas, only thinly coated with gold. He was so successful that he left his wife and family and lived lavishly. The scheme ended in betrayal, but Chaloner escaped punishment. He later convinced several printers to print Jacobite materials, and then he turned them in for it, bragging that he had funned, meaning tricked, the king of £1,000. In 1694, the Bank of England was created and began issuing England's first paper money, redeemable for specie. The bank was aware of the risk of counterfeiting, so printed the money on marbled paper indented. But Chaloner found a printer who could copy it. For at least 2 months, the bills passed unnoticed, but he was arrested in 1695. He escaped the noose again by informing on another scheme. Chaloner's success, though sometimes interrupted, had convinced him that the people at the Mint were inept. But he hadn't counted on facing the man who invented calculus. Newton targeted the counterfeiting networks, aiming to find the middlemen who passed the counterfeit coins into circulation and following them back to the coiners. He did make use of agents, but just as often spoke to informers himself, undercover, in the bars and seedy parts of London. He led interrogations and made copious notes on cases. He even had informers in the prisons. Chaloner tried several times to get involved with the Mint, hoping to use it to distribute his counterfeits without intermediaries. He appeared before the House of Commons, claiming that Mint employees were skimming metal and even producing counterfeits from the Mint itself. Chaloner suggested a new employee could oversee all parts of the process, and who better but himself? He suggested milling the edges of coins with a hollow or groove deeper than what they had currently. The House of Commons ordered Newton to allow Mr. Chaloner to make an experiment in relation to guineas. Newton refused, and in his response accused Chaloner of attempting to be made supervisor and then supply an association with tools out of the tower to counterfeit with his own milled money. Newton said he was not allowed to show Chaloner the Mint's methods, but asked Chaloner to describe them so that the Mint could do it themselves. This Chaloner refused, so Newton made his own versions to present. Newton showed the House committee that Chaloner's ideas were not feasible or necessary. The episode proved to be a mistake on Chaloner's part. His accusations and insinuations deeply offended Newton. Chaloner began a new scheme in 1697, setting up operations outside the city. He focused on small shillings, which would be easier to pass if less valuable. One of the engravers volunteered information to a judge about the operation, but that didn't get around to Newton for another 3 months. Newton soon had a man sent to the site, and Chaloner was arrested on September 4th. Chaloner managed to arrange from prison for Newton's best witness to flee to Scotland, and the case fell apart. Chaloner was free again. But he was broke and getting desperate. He next tried to counterfeit so-called malt lottery tickets. The tickets were issued by the government as a desperate attempt to finance the military. His scheme immediately fell apart. The man meant to finance the plot went directly to the Treasury Secretary. They allowed Chaloner to make his plates, hoping to collect evidence. He caught wind of the investigation and tried to jump ship, but was arrested again. By January 1699, Newton was hard at work questioning anyone and everyone in the coining. He built an impressive list of people willing to testify that they had witnessed, helped, and heard of Chaloner's counterfeiting schemes. Another arrested counterfeiter was convinced to turn informant and carefully befriended Chaloner in prison. Chaloner claimed to have made around 30,000 false guineas. Chaloner had one final gambit. He wrote to Newton directly, offering to be of any service to the government. I'll give you the best account I can remember. He told Newton that he had been forced by some persons against my desire to accuse the mint of malfeasance. In 3 increasingly desperate letters, he begged Newton to believe him. In the end, he said executing him would be a crime. If I die, I am murdered. Newton made no reply. Chaloner in jail began to panic. In one event, he ran stark naked at midnight for half an hour. In another, he was bound hand and foot in his bed. Newton made 3 essential charges against Chaloner. 2 were about counterfeiting activities, the third for inducing a witness to leave the country. At trial in March 1699, Chaloner was finally cornered. He was out of money to bribe, lacked any more friends outside the prison, and no longer had a way to turn informer. There was no right to representation. He had to defend himself. One of the judges called Chaloner notorious as he opened the proceedings. Newton made no effort to prove the specific charges, instead overwhelming the jury with a train of people testifying about years of counterfeiting activities. Chaloner complained, rightly, that the alleged crimes took place in London, and yet he was tried by a Middlesex jury. Chaloner accused the witnesses of perjury to avoid punishment for their own crimes. One record says Chaloner was very saucy to the judge. He was quickly judged guilty by the jury of high treason and sentenced to be hanged. He wrote a final letter to Newton where he reiterated his complaints about his unprecedented trial. "My offending you has brought this upon me," he said. "Dear, so do this merciful deed for God's sake, if not mine. Keep me from being murdered." He was hanged on March 22nd. A biography printed immediately after his execution summarized, "Thus lived and thus died a man who, had he squared his talent by the rules of justice and integrity, might have been useful to the Commonwealth." In all, Newton managed to convict at least 28 counterfeiters, and he had many more jailed. But in 1699, he was appointed master of the mint, and the job of investigating and prosecuting fell to the new warden. Newton's role in the great recoinage, which is probably more apropos to his legacy, brought scientific rigor to the minting of English coins and had a large impact on coinage going forward, especially in England and the United States. But his role as a detective is perhaps more historically interesting. Because after all, what sleuth in all of history, in fiction or in real life, has a greater claim to the title, history's smartest detective? I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.